Okay, so now that I'm happy with the speckling part of this, you kind of see that there's blue and red, very, very subtle textures and, that simulate veins and capillaries and kind of the underlining elements in human skin. So what I want to do is I want to accentuate some of the shadows of this guy. Without being really heavy, I'm going to use the Skin Illustrator. It's a certain kind of brown called Darth Moss. And with this, I do want to go really light. So pretty much the same consistency as the blue and the reds. I'm going to mix this paint with a whole lot of alcohol. I never really shadow with black paint because I feel that black kind of looks goofy and unprofessional. In my opinion, you can do whatever you want. I shadow with tones of the same base color. So if this is a tan or peach flesh-colored creature, then you should use tones of that same color, which is a brown, not a black. So what I've done is, I've made some of this paint, brown paint, really thin with alcohol. You could test it out if you want on some paper, see how thin that can be for you. And what I've done is, if you could see, this is another tricky part. If you take your airbrush, this Iwata comes with, let me put it back on. The Iwata comes with a guard on the front of this airbrush. Okay, and taking this guard off actually exposes the needle that's inside of here. And what that enables you to do is get really finite details. The dangerous part of this is if you drop this or bump that needle, then your entire airbrush is pretty much useless unless you have another needle. So you have to be extremely careful in doing this. I don't really suggest doing it for the sake of protecting your equipment, but it gets really nice fine lines. So I'm going to take that risk. And I'm just going to pretty much shadow a lot of the recesses of the sculpture. And since, this is a dual action airbrush, I can go heavier on some areas, lighter on some others. Okay, not only does this brown shadow things, but it also still kind of takes down the bright peach baby skin color of this thing. It's gradually becoming more monstery, which is what you want. So when I was actually dusting this to kill some of that pink earlier and build up a flesh tone, that was on the top surface of the sculpture. Now, in shadowing, I am trying to go in and get the crevices and wrinkles and cracks. That's what I want to shadow. So the pink that I put on will still show through where I want it to. And this, I'll be able to really kind of make these folds pop out a little more. As you can see, the layer I'm putting on is very, very faint. Still very bland and not very dimensional right now because I haven't shadowed the shapes. And over here at the neck, you can see that it's becoming much more lifelike and interesting to see. So I'm just following the contours of the sculpture. This is where I'm going to start a process called mottling, or some people call it figure eights. And I'll show you on this piece of paper. What you want to do is basically take your airbrush with the needle sticking out and make kind of sporadic shapes. Now, some people do figure eights. I don't really necessarily like figure eights. I do something, I don't even, really have a name for it. It's just kind of shaky, herky-jerky, which is kind of like this. And what that does is it's what's called breakup. Kind of breaks up the patterns and shapes of your object, but also adds tones and kind of skin design, if you will. Depends on the colors. So it's very cloudy and weird looking, but that really is the same exact pattern I'm going to be putting onto this thing with different colors. Doing this in a darker color obviously will show up more, which is what I'm going to be doing with blacks. And this can actually be very taxing on your hand, your fingers, your wrist, everything. It's very kind of physical work. Prolonged period of time, it can actually be kind of painful. So just go at your own pace. But that's what I'm trying to achieve here. So not just only shadowing, but I am going to do some of that mottling here too, so that I don't have everything so wispy and airbrushy looking. And that technique applies to everything you paint, whether it's a maquette or a makeup or a pullover mask or a statue or a prop. Doesn't matter. The modeling really helps with everything you paint. So referring to my reference photos of this creature, a lot of this stuff is going to get really dark. So none of this like crab-like texture, this hard shell look, is going to stay fleshy at all. It just helps that if you do everything in kind of stages, it's not really paint by numbers. You don't do this part flesh, you don't do that part black. If you do everything in the same kind of stages, it starts to flow a lot better and gives you a little bit more leeway if you make mistakes. But this part right here in particular is going to be pretty dark. Like with every step and process of painting, you can do things multiple times until you feel happy with it. So some of these folds that I've gone over once, I might want to go over again to make them a little bit darker, to kind of really accentuate. That's completely up to you as the painter to shadow and show what you want to show without making it too what I call airbrushy. And that seems to be a term for overuse of an airbrush, things to look very wispy and kind of production line quality, which is what you want to avoid. So it's not just a production piece, it's more of a maquette that looks more realistic and not so much what you could buy at the store, you know. So now that I've finished the shadowing, I'm going to stay with the same color and actually do some mottling and get some more kind of aquatic creature patterns going on. I'm going to start off with this brown, kind of model it in where it's supposed to go. So every layer that I'm doing with this greenish brown on top of this eel is getting darker and darker. So you can start to see that there's an animal type pattern coming through. Like I mentioned earlier, it's very kind of taxing on your hand and your joints to do this technique of modeling. So if you got to take a break, stop, stretch out a little bit. It is kind of a physical process. As you can see, it's kind of difficult to airbrush behind some of the objects that I've put on here, but hopefully you can also see why I decided to glue it together and seam it first, because such a delicate paint job, if I painted everything separately, then glued it on, and then tried to repaint that seam, I don't think it would come out very well. I think you would definitely see where it had been glued together. So as you can see with the larger tail section, I'm doing kind of a broader, bigger modeling pattern because this guy's going to get pretty dark on the skin surface. You can start to see really there's a huge difference between the animal skin and the underneath suction cup type feel. So I'm going to go a little bit bigger with my airbrush strokes here, kind of cover more area and create a broader pattern. Again, I'm going to go over this several times because it's all about the layers. Again, I just kind of repeat layers. They'll get darker eventually. So I was using this color, Darth Moss, to do a lot of my modeling, which is very faint, but you can still see it. And what I've decided to do now is actually kind of go heavier with the paint and not mix alcohol into it. I'm going pretty much straight color out of the bottle, so you can start to see the darker tones. And that's okay because I want it to start light and go darker because it's harder to work backwards. And I'm really just working in this kind of frog-like aquatic creature pattern going on. I think my free-forming, the modeling, is just basically trying to get a texture down on all the creature surfaces. I know the whole thing's a creature, but it kind of strays back and forth to a big pile of guts, then turns into a tentacle that turns into a big frog leg. That sort of this half human arm thing comes out, human arm that turns kind of frog-like. And there's no, even though I have reference material, the reference material right now is very dark, so I'm still trying to just establish the undertones of what's there. I think the way that it works is you really never get it until it's done. And then when it's done, you're like, oh, I get it. So after practicing and painting a lot of things, you realize that you're basically painting from the ground up. So all the final blacks and stuff I'm going to do last. That's why I won't paint the eyes or the teeth or the nails until the very last thing. So I'm kind of doing all the subdermal textures, all the different patterns that underlie the very final product. So it never really comes together until it's come together and it's done. Just kind of a weird way to explain it, but I think it's just how it works out. So just with my experience and my very limited knowledge on biology, the way this kind of works is all the soft tissues of frogs, even though the whole thing is soft, the underlying skin textures are kind of lighter. And it seems like with sharks and a lot of aquatic things, underneath is lighter, on top is darker. So most of my underneath surfaces, you can see here, pink, under here, pinks and whites, as well as like with this arm, pink underneath. Everything on top kind of has this greenish marbling texture that I'm putting on there. So that definitely sells the idea that it's an aquatic creature. And I think, I'm not sure how much that applies in nature, but it seems like everything seems to be like that. Kind of darker on top, lighter on the bottom. Like I said, sharks are like that. And because this is an aquatic monster, I really want to establish the fact that this is a very frog-type pattern. It's not, it doesn't have cheetah spots. It doesn't have giraffe spots. You know what I mean? There's definitely a style to what I'm doing for this type of creature. But like with this little arm, I want it to sort of have a reptilian or amphibian kind of pattern and then fade into what looks like a hand that was fading into a human hand, and kind of because it's very thing-like, it's transforming from one thing to another. And this isn't verbatim as to the reference that I have, because my paint reference is actually kind of limited. So I do have the freedom to kind of make something up, but as long as I keep in the realm of what I think the creature is, then people aren't going to go, hey, that totally looks nothing like that, Unless it's one of the guys who actually worked on it and said, hey, that doesn't look anything like it. And I'm like, okay, you might know.